She was sick, broke, and exhausted. No dramatic breakthrough, no sudden opportunity, just a quiet moment where she said, "I started believing and everything changed." People hear stories like that and assume belief is magic, that if you just believe hard enough, life rearranges itself. But that's not what really happened, because belief is never the first thing to change. It's the first thing we can see. Long before someone's life shifts on the outside, something subtle moves on the inside. A way of seeing cracks, an old certainty loosens, and reality begins to respond. If you've ever wondered why belief seems to transform some people and do nothing for others, the answer isn't faith or luck. It's understanding what belief actually starts, and what happens long before anyone notices. Belief is the part everyone can see. It's the sentence someone says out loud. I believe things can change. I believe this will work. I believe in myself now. From the outside, it sounds simple, almost light. But belief is never where the real process begins. It's where the process becomes visible. What actually changes a life happens long before a belief is spoken. It happens quietly, internally, and often without words. Belief is like the tip of an iceberg breaking the surface. You notice it because it's the first thing that shows. But beneath it, something much larger has already shifted. When someone says they started believing and everything changed, what they're really describing is the moment their inner system reorganized itself. Their attention moved, their sensitivity sharpened, their relationship with reality subtly altered. Belief didn't create that shift. It revealed it. Long before belief appears, something starts loosening inside a person. A habit of seeing the world one way begins to weaken. Certainty starts to crack. The mind becomes just a little less rigid, even if the person doesn't notice it consciously. This is not dramatic. It doesn't feel spiritual or powerful. Often it feels uncomfortable, confusing, or even threatening. But this is where the invisible work begins. Think about how belief actually functions. Belief doesn't force reality to change. It changes what you notice, what you filter in, and what you allow yourself to consider. And that only becomes possible when the old filters stop feeling solid. That doesn't happen because someone decided to be positive. It happens because something internal stopped holding together the way it used to. This is why two people can hear the same idea, the same message, the same opportunity, and only one of them changes. The difference isn't intelligence. It isn't willpower. It's that one of them had already begun an invisible internal shift. Their system was ready to reorganize. The belief simply gave that shift a shape. Belief is not the engine. It's the dashboard light that tells you the engine is already running. This is also why trying to believe harder almost never works. When the invisible process hasn't begun, belief becomes a performance. You repeat phrases, you adopt language, you tell yourself a story. But underneath, nothing has moved. The inner structure is intact, untouched, unmoved, and reality reflects that. When belief is real, it doesn't feel like effort. It feels like alignment. Something inside you quietly agrees before your mind explains it. Your body responds before your thoughts catch up. There's a sense of inevitability, not excitement. Calm, not force. That's how you know the invisible process is already underway. Most people misunderstand belief because they think it's a starting point. In truth, it's a midpoint. It arrives after something has already broken, softened, or opened. That opening can come from pain, exhaustion, loss, or even a sudden insight. But it always comes first. Without it, belief has nothing to stand on. This is why belief can feel dangerous when it forms too quickly. If the invisible groundwork hasn't been done, belief becomes fragile. It collapses under pressure. It turns into self-blame when things don't change fast enough. But when belief rises naturally from an inner shift, it doesn't need protection. It doesn't need constant reassurance. It holds because it's supported by a deeper change in perception. You don't believe something into existence. You see differently first, and belief follows. This is subtle, and it's rarely explained. We celebrate belief because it's visible, shareable, easy to name. We don't talk about the quiet moment before it when someone noticed something they couldn't unsee, when a question appeared that wouldn't go away, when the old explanations stopped satisfying them. That moment doesn't look like belief, but it's the true beginning. If you pay attention, you'll notice this in your own life. Real belief never arrives alone. It brings a strange sense of exposure with it, as if something internal has been rearranged and can't be put back the same way. That's because belief didn't create the change. It revealed that something inside you had already given way, and this is where the story becomes uncomfortable. Because what causes that invisible shift is rarely comfort or desire. It's usually a rupture, something that makes the old way of seeing unsustainable, something that quietly breaks your inner continuity. Belief is just the moment that break becomes visible. And what breaks, what gives way, what collapses inside a person before belief ever appears, that is where the real transformation begins. Every real belief begins with an inner rupture, not a gentle decision, not a motivational moment. A rupture. Something inside you breaks open, and for a brief moment the structure that held your life together no longer feels stable. People often say they changed because they wanted to. That's almost never true. Wanting is cheap. Wanting keeps the old system intact. Real change begins when wanting is no longer enough to hold things together, when the inner pressure becomes too great, when the way you've been living, thinking, or explaining your life stops working. This rupture doesn't always look dramatic from the outside. Sometimes it's loud, illness, loss, failure, betrayal, but just as often it's quiet. A sentence that lands differently, a realization that keeps returning, a sense that something is deeply off, even though everything appears fine. The rupture isn't about what happens, it's about what collapses internally. You can go years carrying beliefs that don't truly belong to you, ideas inherited from family, culture, fear, or survival. They feel solid because they've never been questioned. Then one day something punctures them, not with logic but with experience, and suddenly the belief that once felt unquestionable begins to feel hollow. That moment is uncomfortable, disorienting. You may feel weaker, not stronger, less certain, not empowered. This is why many people try to avoid it or rush past it. They want the comfort of belief without the discomfort of rupture. But belief that hasn't passed through rupture is borrowed. It sits on the surface. It doesn't transform anything. An inner rupture is not a failure of strength. It's the failure of a structure that was no longer aligned with reality. It's the psyche admitting, often reluctantly, this doesn't work anymore. And when that admission happens, even silently, space opens. That space is dangerous and fertile at the same time. Dangerous because the old reference points are gone. Fertile because something new can finally take root. Before rupture, the mind is closed by certainty. After rupture, the mind is open, but unprotected. This is where belief will eventually form, but not yet. Many people mistake rupture for weakness. They feel ashamed of it. They think something is wrong with them because they feel lost, confused, or destabilized. In truth, rupture is often the most honest moment of a person's life. It's when the internal story stops pretending. You don't choose rupture, it chooses you. It arrives when the gap between who you are and how you're living becomes impossible to ignore. It's the point where the cost of staying the same becomes higher than the fear of changing. This is why true belief never feels like a clean beginning. It emerges from rubble, from something that didn't survive, from an internal death, however small. A belief that hasn't destroyed anything before it appears is usually decorative. It sits nicely in language but doesn't move behavior. Notice how people who truly change often say things like, "I had no other choice," or "I couldn't go on the same way." That's not drama, that's accuracy. The rupture removed the illusion of choice. It narrowed the path. And only then could belief form, not as hope but as orientation. This is also why timing matters so much. You can hear the right idea at the wrong time and feel nothing. Then hear the same idea years later, after a rupture, and it rearranges your entire life. The idea didn't change. You did. Something inside you had already broken open. Rupture doesn't give you answers. It gives you questions that won't leave you alone. It weakens the old explanations. It creates a sensitivity you didn't have before. And in that sensitivity, perception changes. You begin to notice things you once filtered out, possibilities you once dismissed, contradictions you once ignored. This is the soil where belief will grow, not in certainty but in openness, not in control but in surrender to what you no longer know. If you're in a period where things feel unclear, unstable, or quietly painful, it may not be a sign that you're lost. It may be a sign that the internal rupture has already begun. And before belief ever takes shape, before anything can be named or claimed, there is this phase where awareness sharpens and the old world loosens its grip. That awareness, raw, wordless, and often uncomfortable, is the next threshold. Because before belief changes what you do, something else must change first. How you see what's possible at all. When belief takes form, the first thing it touches is not your circumstances. It touches your sense of what is possible. And this shift is far quieter than people expect. There is no explosion of confidence, no sudden certainty. What changes first is the way your mind scans reality. Before belief, the world feels fixed. You move through it as if the rules are already written and unchangeable. You don't question them because they feel like facts. This is how life works. This is how people like me end up. This is what I can expect. These aren't thoughts you argue with. They're assumptions you live inside of. When belief begins, those assumptions loosen. Not all at once, and not dramatically. A small crack appears. You start to sense that the map you've been using may not be complete. And that single crack changes everything, because perception follows possibility. The mind is constantly filtering information. It decides what to notice and what to ignore based on what it believes can happen. If something feels impossible, the mind simply doesn't register the paths leading to it. They exist, but they're invisible to you. Belief doesn't create new paths. It allows you to see the ones that were always there. This is why belief often feels like awakening rather than creation. You don't feel like you're inventing a new reality. You feel like you're finally noticing parts of reality you couldn't see before. Conversations land differently. Opportunities stand out. Risks feel slightly less threatening. None of this is magic. It's attention reorganizing itself. What's important to understand is that this shift doesn't happen because you tell yourself to be optimistic. Forced positivity doesn't change perception. It adds noise. Real belief changes perception because it alters your internal reference point. What once felt off-limits now feels uncertain instead of impossible. And uncertainty, unlike impossibility, invites exploration. This is subtle but powerful. The moment something moves from "that could never happen" to "I don't know, maybe," your behavior begins to change. You ask different questions. You linger longer on ideas you used to dismiss. You tolerate discomfort a bit more. And those small changes compound. People often think belief gives them courage. In reality, belief gives them permission. Permission to try. Permission to fail. Permission to imagine an outcome without immediately shutting it down. That permission comes from a shift in perception, not from willpower. This is also why belief can be fragile at first. The old perception doesn't disappear. It argues back. It reminds you of past failures, statistics, and logic. It tries to close the crack that just opened. And if belief is still shallow, perception snaps back to its old limits. But when belief is rooted in the rupture that came before, the perception shift holds. Even doubt doesn't fully erase it. You may question yourself, but you no longer see the world as closed. Something has been unlocked. Notice how this works in everyday life. When you believe something is possible, you naturally move differently. You prepare differently. You speak differently. You don't even realize you're doing it. That's because perception isn't conscious most of the time. It's a background process guiding your behavior without asking for permission. This is why two people in the same situation live in completely different realities. One sees obstacles everywhere. The other sees variables. One sees doors closing. The other sees timing. The external conditions may be identical, but the perceived field of possibility is not. Belief doesn't guarantee outcomes. It changes the range of outcomes you consider worth engaging with, and that alone reshapes your life over time. There is, however, a shadow side to this, because belief can also narrow perception if it's built on fear. If you believe you are unlovable, the mind will filter for rejection. If you believe you always fail, you will notice every sign that confirms it and miss everything that contradicts it. The mechanism is the same, only the direction changes. This is why belief is so powerful and so dangerous. It doesn't care whether it's true, it cares whether it's internalized. Once it is, perception obeys. Most people never question this process. They think they're responding to reality, when in fact they're responding to a filtered version shaped by what they believe is possible for them. And until that belief changes, reality appears to confirm it again and again. The shift in perception is the real turning point. It's the moment the future stops looking like a repetition of the past. Not because the future is guaranteed to be better, but because it's no longer predetermined in your mind. And yet, this is still not where most people get stuck. The danger comes next, when belief is adopted too quickly, without awareness of how easily the mind can turn it against itself. Because once perception changes, the mind will try to use belief as a shield, a shortcut, or a fantasy. And that's where believing the wrong thing can quietly begin to shape a reality you never intended. Once belief reshapes what you see as possible, it gains influence over every decision you make. And this is where belief becomes dangerous. Not because believing is wrong, but because belief itself is neutral. It amplifies whatever you place inside it, without judgment. Most people think the danger lies in not believing enough. In reality, the deeper risk is believing the wrong thing so completely that you stop questioning it. When a belief becomes invisible to you, it no longer feels like a belief. It feels like truth. And what feels like truth quietly directs your life. A harmful belief doesn't announce itself. It doesn't say, "I'm here to limit you." It sounds reasonable, protective, sometimes even responsible. This is just how things are. I know my limits. I'm being realistic. These beliefs feel mature, grounded, and safe, but beneath them, perception narrows. When you believe something negative about yourself, the mind goes to work to protect that belief. It filters evidence, it edits memories, it interprets neutral events as confirmation. This doesn't happen consciously. You're not lying to yourself, you're obeying a system that wants internal consistency. This is why people can live inside the same painful patterns for decades, without realizing belief is involved at all. They think life is happening to them. They don't see that belief is quietly shaping how they respond, what they attempt, and what they avoid. Believing the wrong thing doesn't always lead to obvious failure. Sometimes it leads to a small, controlled life that looks fine from the outside. You stay within safe boundaries. You avoid disappointment. You avoid risk. And you slowly avoid yourself. The danger isn't collapse, it's contraction. There's another subtle danger here. Once belief becomes identity, it resists change. If you believe, "I am this kind of person," then any evidence that contradicts that belief feels threatening. Not because it's wrong, but because it destabilizes your sense of self. So the mind pushes it away. This is why advice rarely works. You can't argue someone out of a belief that feels like who they are. Logic bounces off. Encouragement feels naive. And the person often doubles down, not because they're stubborn, but because their internal structure depends on that belief staying intact. Even positive-sounding beliefs can be dangerous when they bypass reality. Everything will work out no matter what. I don't need to change anything, it will come to me. These beliefs can numb awareness. They replace observation with fantasy. And when action is required, belief becomes an excuse to stay still. The most damaging beliefs are the ones that disconnect you from direct experience. They tell you what you are before you notice who you're becoming. They predict outcomes before you test possibilities. They close the loop too early. This is where belief turns from a doorway into a cage. And the mind loves cages that feel familiar. Even painful beliefs offer certainty. And certainty, to the nervous system, often feels safer than openness. So the mind clings to beliefs that hurt, simply because they're known. What makes this especially tricky is that belief feels empowering at first. It gives you a sense of explanation. Now I understand why things are the way they are. That understanding brings relief, but relief is not the same as truth. Sometimes it's just the end of questioning. The moment belief stops you from observing, it stops serving you. This is why change often requires something stronger than belief. Because belief alone can lock you into a narrative. It can convince you that you already know what's happening, when in fact you've stopped paying attention. At some point, the very belief that once gave you direction begins to limit your movement. You feel stuck, but you don't know why. You're doing everything right, but nothing shifts. And slowly, frustration grows. That frustration is not a failure. It's a signal, a quiet invitation to look beneath belief itself. To notice how much of your life is being guided by assumptions you never chose consciously. Before belief can serve you again, something else has to take the lead, something more fundamental than conviction, something that doesn't try to control outcomes or protect identity. What begins to matter now is not what you believe, but what you are actually noticing in real time, before belief interprets it, before the mind explains it away. And that movement back into raw awareness is where the next real shift begins. The true origin of change is not belief, it's silent observation, the kind that happens before you decide what something means, before you judge it, explain it, or turn it into a story about yourself. This kind of observation is rare not because it's difficult, but because it feels unproductive. There's no immediate payoff, no sense of control. You're not fixing anything. You're simply noticing. And for a mind trained to solve, defend, and predict, that can feel deeply uncomfortable. Silent observation begins the moment you stop trying to improve what you're seeing. You let an experience exist without correcting it. A reaction arises, and instead of justifying it or suppressing it, you notice it. A pattern repeats, and instead of blaming yourself or others, you stay with the fact that it's happening. This is not passive. It requires honesty. And honesty without narrative can feel raw. Before any real change occurs, there is always a moment like this. A pause where the mind loosens its grip just enough to see clearly. Not optimistically, not pessimistically. Clearly. That clarity is what disrupts the old pattern. Not effort, not belief. Most people skip this step. They move straight from discomfort to belief. They adopt a new idea to escape what they're feeling. They label it growth. But because nothing was truly observed, the old pattern remains underneath, waiting for the next opportunity to surface. Silent observation doesn't try to replace anything. It reveals what's already there. When you observe yourself without commentary, you begin to notice how automatic much of your life has become, how reactions happen before choice, how emotions surge and fade without asking your permission, how often belief steps in to explain things you haven't fully seen yet. This is the point where change actually starts. Not when you decide who you want to be, but when you see who you are being, moment by moment. And this kind of seeing is quiet. There's no emotional high, no breakthrough feeling. Often there's a sense of mild discomfort, even boredom. But underneath that, something important is happening. The system is updating. When observation is silent, it bypasses defense. The mind doesn't feel attacked, so it doesn't resist. It doesn't need to prove anything. It doesn't need to protect identity. It simply registers data. And data changes behavior more reliably than motivation ever could. This is why silent observation precedes belief. It creates the conditions for belief to be accurate instead of imagined. Without observation, belief is blind. With observation, belief becomes grounded. Notice how this works in your own experience. When you truly see a pattern clearly enough, you don't need to convince yourself to change it. The change happens almost automatically, not because you forced it, but because continuing the pattern no longer makes sense. That moment of, I can't unsee this, is observation doing its work. Most people think they need more discipline, more faith, more drive. In reality, they need less interference, less commentary, less internal noise. They need to let reality register fully before trying to shape it. Silent observation also reveals something uncomfortable, how often belief has been used to avoid feeling, to bypass grief, to skip over fear, to cover uncertainty with certainty. Observation removes that cover, and this is where resistance often appears. The mind starts whispering, this is pointless, you already know this. This isn't going anywhere. That's not truth. That's the old structure trying to reassert control. If you stay with observation long enough, something shifts, not dramatically, gently. The emotional charge around certain thoughts weakens, the urgency to react softens. You begin to feel a little more space between stimulus and response. That space is everything. That's where choice is born. From that space, belief can eventually form again, but this time it's not defensive. It's not borrowed. It's not rushed. It's shaped by what you've actually seen, not what you wish were true. But this is also where many people quietly sabotage the process. Because silent observation doesn't feel like progress. There's no identity boost, no story to tell. And the mind, uncomfortable with not knowing, tries to step back in. It tries to name, explain, and conclude too quickly. And if you're not aware of that impulse, observation turns into interpretation, and the old cycle resumes. This is the moment where the inner call toward change is either allowed to deepen or shut down before belief ever has the chance to become real. Most people don't sabotage themselves in loud, obvious ways. They don't consciously choose to fail. The sabotage happens quietly, almost politely, in the moments when something new is trying to form and the mind steps in to shut it down. It usually begins right after silent observation has done its work. You notice a pattern. You feel a subtle inner signal that something needs to change. There's a sense of truth, still fragile, still unnamed. And before it can settle, the mind rushes to protect you. It says things that sound reasonable, practical, intelligent. This is just a phase. You're overthinking. Be realistic. These thoughts don't feel like resistance. They feel like wisdom. And that's why they're so effective. The mind's job is to preserve continuity, to keep you safe by keeping things familiar. So when observation opens a door to the unknown, the mind interprets that openness as risk, and it responds the only way it knows how, by closing the door. This is where many people mistake self-protection for self-awareness. They think they're being grounded when they're actually avoiding uncertainty. They think they're being rational when they're really afraid of destabilizing their identity. Sabotage doesn't come as negativity. It comes as premature certainty. Instead of staying with the discomfort of not knowing, the mind reaches for explanations, labels, conclusions. It turns observation into opinion. It says, I already know how this ends, even when it doesn't. And once that happens, movement stops. Another subtle form of sabotage is distraction. Right when something important is being felt, attention shifts. You scroll. You stay busy. You intellectualize. Anything to avoid sitting with the rawness of what you noticed. Not because it's unbearable, but because it threatens the old structure. There's also the sabotage of self-judgment. You notice a pattern, and instead of observing it, you criticize yourself for having it. Why am I like this? I should be past this by now. That judgment doesn't motivate change. It collapses curiosity, and without curiosity, observation dies. Many people confuse insight with completion. They notice something once and think that's enough. They want to move on quickly, to feel resolved. But insight is not integration. Observation needs time, repetition, space. When it's rushed, the system doesn't update. It snaps back. The most common sabotage, though, is this: trying to turn observation into belief too quickly. You feel something shift, and immediately you want to name it, claim it, build a story around it. This is my new belief. This is who I am now. That urge is understandable, but it's premature. Belief formed too quickly becomes a mask. It covers the rawness that still needs to be felt. And because it's built on incomplete observation, it doesn't hold under pressure. The mind prefers conclusions because conclusions feel safe. They give you a sense of control. But real change doesn't begin with conclusions. It begins with staying present with what hasn't resolved yet. This is where patience becomes essential and why it's so rare. Not the patience of waiting for results, but the patience of staying with uncertainty without trying to manage it. Most people never allow that phase to complete. They interrupt it with reassurance, doubt, logic, or motivation, and then they wonder why nothing truly changes. There's also a deeper layer of sabotage, fear of what observation might cost you. Because if you truly see a pattern, you may no longer be able to justify certain choices, certain relationships, certain comforts, and part of you knows that. So the mind steps in early. It minimizes, it delays, it convinces you there's no urgency, that you can look at this later, and later rarely comes. This is not a personal failure, it's a human reflex. The nervous system is wired to avoid destabilization, but growth requires a controlled kind of destabilization, a willingness to stay present while the old structure loosens. If you pay close attention, you can catch sabotage in real time. It doesn't feel dramatic. It feels like relief, like returning to familiar ground. That relief is the signal that something new was just avoided. The work here is not to fight the mind, but to recognize its timing, to notice when it speaks too soon, when it tries to conclude before the experience has fully registered. Because if observation is allowed to continue, uninterrupted, it naturally leads somewhere deeper. It moves from noticing patterns to questioning assumptions, from seeing reactions to sensing the space before them. And that space is where the next misunderstanding appears, where people try to force belief with thought alone, instead of letting experience complete the process. One of the most common mistakes people make is trying to believe with the mind alone. They hear an idea, understand it logically, agree with it intellectually, and assume belief has happened. But nothing changes. Not their reactions, not their choices, not their lives. And they're left confused, wondering what they're doing wrong. The problem isn't effort, it's location. The mind is not where belief takes root. The mind is excellent at understanding concepts. It can repeat them, defend them, even teach them to others. But understanding is not embodiment. You can understand something deeply and still live as if it weren't true. That gap is where frustration grows. When belief is only mental, it stays abstract. It doesn't reach the nervous system. It doesn't affect how safe or unsafe something feels. And behavior is driven far more by felt safety than by logic. This is why affirmations often fail. You repeat a statement, but your body doesn't agree. Your stomach tightens, your chest closes, your breath shortens, and without realizing it, you're getting constant feedback that the belief hasn't landed. The system is unconvinced. Real belief changes how your body responds to the world. Your posture shifts, your timing changes, your tolerance for discomfort expands. These are not decisions. They are consequences of experience. Experience is what teaches the system what is real, not ideas. You don't believe fire is hot because someone explained it to you. You believe it because at some point your body learned. That learning didn't require motivation. It didn't require repetition. It happened because experience left a mark. Belief formed through experience doesn't need reinforcement. It doesn't need reminders. It lives below thought. When people try to believe with the mind, they often bypass experience entirely. They adopt language without allowing their behavior to test it. They say, "I believe this will work," but they don't move differently. And because there's no feedback from reality, belief remains hypothetical. This creates a split. The mind says one thing, the body does another. And over time, trust erodes. Not in the idea, but in oneself. People start thinking they lack discipline or faith, when in fact they've been trying to install belief in the wrong place. Experience doesn't have to be dramatic. It doesn't require big risks or life-altering moves. Small actions are often more effective because they're believable to the nervous system. When you act in a way that slightly contradicts an old belief and survive, the system updates. That update doesn't feel inspiring. It feels neutral, calm, ordinary, but it's real. The mind, however, wants certainty up front. It wants to believe first, act later. Experience works in the opposite direction. You act a little, observe what happens, and belief adjusts accordingly. This is why forced belief feels exhausting. You're constantly holding a position that hasn't been earned through experience. And anything that hasn't been earned requires maintenance. There's also a subtle form of self-betrayal here. When you claim a belief you haven't lived, part of you knows it's not true yet. That knowing creates tension, and tension turns belief into pressure. Real belief is not pressured, it's settled. Another mistake is trying to override fear with belief. You tell yourself you believe everything will be fine, but fear is still present. Instead of observing the fear, you argue with it. That doesn't dissolve fear, It drives it underground, where it continues to shape behavior. Experience integrates fear. Belief tries to suppress it. This doesn't mean belief is useless. It means belief is a result, not a tool. It consolidates what experience has already taught. It gives language to what the body already knows. When belief comes after experience, it feels obvious, almost boring. Of course this works. Of course I can do this. There's no hype, no inner debate. That's how you know belief is real. Most people never allow belief to form this way. They rush it. They try to think their way into a new identity, and when it doesn't stick, they assume something is wrong with them. Nothing is wrong. They're just skipping a step. Before belief can move anything, experience has to lead. Observation has to continue. Small actions have to create feedback, and the system has to feel, not just understand, that something new is possible. When that happens, belief stops being something you try to hold. It becomes something that quietly holds you. And from there, movement begins. Not forced, not dramatic, but undeniable. Real change does not begin the moment you say you believe something. It begins when belief starts to move you. Not in big, dramatic ways, but in small, almost unnoticeable shifts in behavior that happen without force. When belief is real, movement feels natural. You don't hype yourself up. You don't negotiate with yourself for hours. You simply do something slightly different than before. You return a call you've been avoiding. You speak more honestly. You take a step that used to feel unnecessary or impossible, and you don't announce it. You just move. This is how belief reveals itself, not through words, but through motion. Movement is the bridge between inner change and outer reality. Without it, belief stays internal, untested. With it, belief enters the world and begins to interact with real conditions. And those conditions respond, not always kindly, but honestly. This is where many people get confused. They expect movement to feel confident. It rarely does. Most of the time it feels awkward, uncertain, slightly uncomfortable. That doesn't mean belief is weak. It means belief is new. Old patterns feel smooth because they're practiced. New movements feel clumsy because the system hasn't adapted yet. If you mistake that clumsiness for a sign you're wrong, you retreat too soon. Real movement doesn't wait for certainty. It creates it. When belief activates movement, your nervous system begins to collect new data. I did this and I survived. I tried this and the world didn't collapse. That data slowly rewires what feels safe and possible, and as that happens, belief strengthens without effort. This is why action is not about forcing results. It's about feedback. Each small movement gives the system information. That information updates perception, and updated perception leads to the next movement. This loop is where transformation actually happens. Notice how this differs from motivation. Motivation is emotional and unstable. It spikes and fades. Movement rooted in belief is steady. It doesn't rely on mood. It continues even when enthusiasm is low. Most people wait to feel ready before they move, but readiness is a feeling that comes after movement, not before. When belief is alive, it bypasses readiness and goes straight to action. This doesn't mean reckless action. It means congruent action. The movement matches the belief. If you believe you deserve honesty, you speak more honestly. If you believe change is possible, you try something new. If belief doesn't change behavior, it's still theoretical. Movement is also where self-deception becomes impossible. You can't pretend to believe something once your actions contradict it. Reality provides immediate feedback, and that feedback, while sometimes uncomfortable, is clarifying. This is why many people unconsciously avoid movement. As long as belief stays internal, it can't be disproven. The moment you move, you risk discovering where belief is still incomplete. That vulnerability keeps people stuck in thought. But without movement, belief decays. It turns into hope, then into frustration, then into self-blame. When movement begins, something else shifts too. Your identity loosens. You stop thinking of yourself as someone who believes and start experiencing yourself as someone who does. And that difference is profound. You begin to trust yourself, not because you succeeded, but because you acted. Trust grows from consistency, not outcomes. There's also an energetic quality to movement that's hard to describe but easy to feel. When belief moves through the body into action, your presence changes. People respond differently to you. Situations open in subtle ways. Not because the universe rewards belief, but because behavior alters dynamics. This is the point where many people think the hard part is over. They feel momentum, things start to align, and then, often unexpectedly, something begins to fall apart. Plans unravel, relationships strain, old structures weaken, and confusion returns. This is where belief is tested at a deeper level, because real belief doesn't just create, it dismantles. And the movement you initiated begins to unsettle parts of your life that were built on the old way of being. If you don't understand this phase, you might think you made a mistake, but this is not regression. It's the next necessary consequence of movement, because when belief truly activates, it doesn't just add something new to your life. It challenges what can no longer remain. Every true belief destroys something before it builds anything new. This is the part no one likes to talk about, because it doesn't feel like growth, it feels like loss, confusion, instability. And if you're not prepared for it, you may think you've gone in the wrong direction. When belief becomes real and begins to move you, it inevitably collides with the structures that were built around the old way of being. Habits, relationships, routines, even self-images that once made sense start to feel tight. Not wrong at first, just uncomfortable, like clothes that no longer fit. This destruction is not violent, it's gradual. Things stop working the way they used to. What once motivated you now feels empty. What once felt safe begins to feel restrictive, and you don't always know why. Belief doesn't announce what it's about to dismantle. It simply changes your internal alignment. And when alignment changes, misalignment becomes impossible to ignore. This is why people often quit right here. They interpret the discomfort as failure. They think belief was a mistake, that they aimed too high, that they misunderstood something. But what's actually happening is that the old structure is losing its authority. True belief threatens the system that was designed to protect you before you knew better. There is grief in this phase, even when the belief is positive. You may grieve the version of yourself who stayed small. You may grieve the certainty you once had. You may grieve relationships that can't follow you into this new orientation. And because this grief isn't recognized socially, it can feel lonely. This is where many people try to reverse course. They return to familiar beliefs because at least those come with a known identity. But once something has been destroyed internally, it can't be rebuilt the same way. You may go back, but it will never feel solid again. Destruction also shows up as resistance from the outside. When you change, systems around you react. People who benefited from your old patterns may push back. Environments that supported the old version of you may no longer respond the same way. This isn't punishment, it's friction. Belief doesn't isolate you, it reveals incompatibilities. The hardest part of this phase is not knowing what will replace what's falling apart. You're between structures. The old one is collapsing, and the new one isn't fully formed yet. This is where doubt grows strongest. The mind wants reassurance, a timeline, proof that this is worth it. But belief can't offer that yet, because it hasn't finished its work. What's important here is understanding that destruction is not a side effect. It's a requirement. Something has to make room. Energy, attention, time, identity, these are limited resources. If belief is to build something new, it must reclaim them from what came before. This doesn't mean everything in your old life disappears. It means everything is reevaluated. Some things adapt, others fall away. And that process is rarely clean. People often think rebirth feels light. In reality, it feels heavy before it feels free. There is an awkward in-between stage where nothing feels stable. And that instability is precisely what allows reorganization to occur. If you rush to stabilize too quickly, you rebuild the old structure under a new name. You call it growth, but it's repetition. Real belief doesn't let you settle for that. This phase demands tolerance for ambiguity, the ability to stay present while things are unresolved, without forcing conclusions, without rushing identity, without abandoning the movement you initiated. Most people don't fail because belief was wrong. They fail because they misinterpret destruction as a sign to stop. They don't realize they are in the middle, not the end. If you can stay here, if you can let what no longer fits continue to dissolve, something quieter begins to emerge. Not excitement, clarity, a sense of coherence you didn't have before. But even then, the full picture isn't visible yet. Because what people eventually call a breakthrough, a miracle, or a sudden change is never sudden at all. It's simply the moment when the invisible cycle that began long ago finally completes and becomes visible to everyone else. What people call a miracle is almost never a single moment. It's the end of an invisible cycle that began long before anyone noticed. By the time the result appears, the real work has already been done, quietly, gradually, and without applause. From the outside, it looks sudden, a health shift, a financial opening, a relationship that changes overnight. People say it came out of nowhere, but nothing comes out of nowhere. It comes out of a long sequence of internal adjustments that no one sees because they don't look impressive. The cycle always starts small, a moment of noticing, a pause where someone sees something they can't unsee. That moment doesn't look like a miracle. It looks like confusion, or discomfort, or fatigue, but it's the first turn of the wheel. Then comes rupture. Something breaks internally. An old explanation no longer holds. A belief loosens. Identity wobbles. Again, nothing miraculous about it. In fact, most people would call this phase a problem. After that comes observation. Silent, uncelebrated, often lonely. The person watches their own reactions, their patterns, their avoidance. There is no visible progress yet. But internally the system is recalibrating. Belief forms later, not as hope, but as orientation, a subtle shift in what feels possible. That belief activates movement, small actions, different choices, slight changes in behavior that don't look heroic, but are deeply consistent. Movement creates friction. Old structures begin to fall apart. Relationships strain. Old habits lose their grip. This phase feels like loss, not gain. And many people quit here, unaware of how close they are to the end of the cycle. If the movement continues, something stabilizes. A new coherence forms. The person is no longer forcing change. They're inhabiting it. And only then does the external world begin to reflect what has already shifted internally. That reflection is what people call a miracle. They don't see the years of internal work compressed into that moment. They don't see the doubts endured without resolution, the patience required to stay in the in-between, the courage to move without guarantees. They only see the outcome, and because they don't understand the cycle, they assume the result was extraordinary. It wasn't. It was inevitable, given the internal alignment that preceded it. This misunderstanding creates false expectations. People wait for miracles to save them, not realizing they're meant to complete a process, not interrupt it. They look for signs instead of patterns. They want the ending without walking the path. A real miracle doesn't feel magical when it happens. It feels natural, almost obvious, like something finally clicked into place. That's because, internally, it already did, long ago. This is why comparison is so misleading. You see someone's result and assume it's recent. You don't see how long they lived without external confirmation, how many times they questioned themselves, how many cycles they completed quietly. The danger is thinking you're behind because nothing visible has happened yet. In reality, you may be in the most important part of the process, the part that can't be rushed and can't be shared. If you understand this, impatience softens. You stop measuring progress by outcomes alone. You start paying attention to alignment, consistency, and coherence. You trust the cycle because you recognize its stages. Nothing about this process is mystical. It's deeply human. It's how systems reorganize, how perception reshapes behavior, how internal order eventually expresses itself externally. When the result finally arrives, it doesn't announce itself as a miracle. It feels like the natural conclusion of something you've been living for a long time. And once you see that, the question shifts. You stop asking when the miracle will come. You start asking where you are in the cycle and whether you're allowing it to complete. Transformation doesn't begin when you try harder or believe louder. It begins when you learn to see in a way no one ever taught you. When you stop forcing meaning onto your life and start noticing what's actually happening inside you and around you. That way of seeing is quiet. It doesn't impress anyone, but it changes everything. Once you see clearly, belief stops being something you chase. It becomes something that grows naturally from experience. Movement follows. Old structures fall away. New ones take shape. And what looks like a miracle from the outside feels, to you, like the honest completion of a long inner process. If this resonated, write this sentence in the comments so I know you stayed with me until the end. I'm learning to see differently. And if you felt something shift while listening, if you want to go deeper, watch one of the videos appearing on your screen now. They continue this exploration from another angle, and they're there for you if you want more of this kind of clarity.